Recently, I did a video talking about Blackwork embroidery where I wanted to see how long I could talk about it non-stop before I had to start my day. But then after I stopped the video and put it up on YouTube, I realized that there were certain things that I forgot to mention, or there were pictures I wanted to show and didn't have time to share on the video. And so today's video, I wanted to share with you anything and everything about Blackwork embroidery. The earlier form of it and the later form, so the double running stitch, the geometric stitch, as well as the later swirly floral type, both found in the 16th century, where to find these patterns, but also what type of embroidery frame to use, what type of needle to use, what type of fabric to use, what do you embroider it with? Do you embroider with silk thread or wool thread? Just so many things. Where do you find the patterns, and how do you recreate the pattern if, say, you're looking at a portrait, or even if you're looking at a sampler, how do you figure out how many holes in the linen for each stitch? And so I want to dive deep into that today. I'm going to put chapters in this video because it's going to be a rather long video. And so if, say, you already know what type of embroidery frame you want to use, you could skip ahead to learn about the needles or how to draft the pattern. And so I hope you enjoy this video, and if you do happen to enjoy it, please select thumbs up that you like the video. It does help with the algorithm. And if you have a moment, please click subscribe and ring the bell to be updated when new videos come out. First, in the SCA, the Society for Creative Anachronism. The SCA is an international nonprofit educational organization that studies and recreates the years approximately 600 to 1600 AD. And I have been a member of the SCA since I was 16. I first learned how to do blackwork embroidery when I was 16. I went to an SCA event, took a class, and just got super excited about it and dived right in. As it was, I already knew how to do cross stitch, and whenever I did cross stitch, how I would outline my pictures wound up being how you do blackwork embroidery. And that's the geometric, where you go in, out, in, out, and out, and then go back, so it's a double running stitch. And so I got super excited, and then I dived right in and started doing blackwork embroidery. Well, fast forward some years, and as it is, I have 3 college degrees. My first college degree, my thesis, was actually on blackwork embroidery. It actually helped me with the beginnings of my documentation for an arts and sciences project that I was working on. So kind of a 2 birds, 1 stone with that. And so as it is, for my personal life, I am married. I'm a mother of 4. I work for the family business. So when I am not busy working or being a chauffeur to our 4 busy children, I am also active in the SCA and also enjoy doing blackwork embroidery. So I have been studying blackwork for over 20 years. I have an embroidery blog that I've been doing for about the last 10 years. I will have a link below in the description for that. So anything that I've come across, either research, portraits, just interesting tidbits, I put it in that blog. I've also uploaded videos onto my YouTube channel for the last 4 or 5 years now. So please check out my other videos, and I hope you enjoy blackwork as much as I do. So my main focus for over the 20 plus years has been 16th century English blackwork embroidery. And with that, I like to focus on the earlier 16th century blackwork, which is also known as Holbein Stitch or Spanish Stitch. It's a double running stitch. The later form of blackwork in the 16th century, which I'll get more into this later, is more of a swirly floral. It's a curvy linear embroidery. But leading up to the 16th century, if you go back, look at Mamluk embroidery. Mamluk embroidery existed from about the 10th to the 14th century in Egypt, and then it made its way through the trade routes through Spain and through Italy, up through Europe, and then started to become a thing in possibly the 14th century, definitely by the 15th century, and then we really see it in the 16th century. If you would like to know more about Mamluk embroidery, I highly recommend looking at Mistress Miriam's blog. Her blog on WordPress is no longer active, but she also has videos on YouTube. But she is in the Kingdom of Lokak, but she really knows her stuff, and I highly recommend checking her out. I will have links below to her blog. And so anyways, the Mamluk embroidery made its way through Europe, through the trade routes, became a thing, and in the late 14th century, Geoffrey Chaucer in the Canterbury Tales referred to the miller's wife, whose name I believe is Alison. He referred to her as wearing a dainty white smock with black embroidery both alike within and without. I don't know about you, but to me that sounds a lot like the reversible blackwork that is iconic of the early 16th century in England with the Holbein Stitch. And so when you start to look at 16th century in England, and I'm specifically saying in England because there were in 16th century, there were embroidery books that were either German or Italian. And I actually have a list on my blog. I will have a link below in the description of different embroidery books that existed. And it more or less looks like some of them plagiarized off of each other, where they would take this plate and then turn the plate over, and then this page 18A became my 21B. And so some of the patterns you will find, like, they're German, but they could be Italian, but anyways, I will have a link below in my blog, or a link below in the description to that blog link that shows the different books that exist online, so you can actually click on the links and then be able to see a particular book, like if it was a German book from, we'll say, 1564 versus an Italian book that existed from 1537. But I like to focus specifically on 16th century blackwork. And so when you start to look at 16th century English blackwork, with that, the main thing is Holbein Stitch. It was also known as Spanish Stitch, and that was known as Spanish Stitch because Catherine of Aragon, the first wife of Henry VIII, and he's the famous king with 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Catherine of Aragon was a Spanish princess. She originally married Henry's older brother, Arthur. Arthur died a few months after their marriage. Fast forward, I think it was about 6 years or so, and then Henry and Catherine got married, and she made blackwork embroidery popular in England. Like I said, it was already referenced by Geoffrey Chaucer more than a century earlier, so it was already there, but I think she just made it more popular. And with that, that's why it was known as Spanish Stitch. But once Henry divorced Catherine, then it was no longer popular to have Spanish influences. But people really liked their embroidery, so they just renamed it blackwork. And then that's where Holbein, with Hans Holbein the Younger, he was a court painter in Henry VIII's court, and he painted at least 31 portraits that we know of that have blackwork embroidery. There were other artists who were painting portraits at this time with blackwork embroidery, and that's throughout Europe. But like one artist, you might have found only one portrait that exists with his blackwork. Another artist might have painted maybe 2 or 3. Whereas Hans Holbein painted at least 31. Some of the paintings still exist where we don't have the sketches, or we have the sketches, but the paintings were lost either mainly due to fire, to war. Some of them just probably were painted over at some point, because there are examples of that as well. And I have videos on my blog or on my YouTube channel discussing the different Holbein sketches and paintings and where to find what embroidery pattern. But from that, we know that the geometric patterns were very popular in the 1520s and in the 1530s. However, by the 1540s, that's where the geometric shape starts to give way to the curvy linear. So geometric, imagine a counted stitch. You are doing a double running stitch. So you have 2 threads, one going in, out, in, out, in, out, and out to the very end. So if I'm doing, like, say, a collar or a cuff, I'm going from one side all the way to the other, and now I've got a bunch of dashed lines. And then on the return journey, I'm going to take my other thread and go all the way back and fill in all those dashed lines. So now I have what looks like a reversible pattern on both the front and the back side. About the 1540s is when we start to see the curvy linear patterns. That's the swirly floral patterns. That is iconic of the later 16th century in England. And with that, you would have prick and pounce. And with prick and pounce, what that is you would have a pattern probably from a pattern book. And then you would sit there and poke holes in the pattern, lay the pattern down on your fabric, and then take charcoal powder and brush it over top. And so then when you lift up the paper, you can move the paper around on the fabric and then do the charcoal pattern. So when you lift it all up, you have little dots, and then you could take ink and trace the dots, connect the dots, and then create a pattern onto the linen fabric, and then they would just embroider over that. And with that, they would use black ink. However, there are a couple of examples at the Victoria and Albert Museum that show blue ink, but when talking with a lady at Pensick who was doing some painting at the Craftsperson's Green at Pensick for Mid-Realm Royal, it probably was originally black that faded to blue, which makes sense because if I've got black lines and I'm embroidering over, if I'm tracing over with embroidery, black on black, it's easier to hide the black ink if I'm embroidering black over it. But if I've got blue ink with black silk thread, then the blue might show. So it makes sense that the blue was probably originally black. But so what they would do, the charcoal powder, like I said, you put that on through the dots, lift up the paper, you've got dots, then you take ink and you connect the dots. Now you've got a pattern traced onto the fabric, and now you just do the embroidery over it. This is where some patterns that we have that actually examples that exist at the Victoria and Albert Museum, I will have some links below in the description so you can go check them out. But some of this swirly floral blackwork was reversible, and then some of it wasn't. Most of it, it's because of depends on which stitch you were using for that particular embroidery. You see, the earlier form in 16th century was a double running stitch. And so that's, like I said, where you go, what I said earlier with how you go in, out, in, out, in, out, and then you go back the way you came and you fill in all the spaces, and now it's reversible on front and back. That's a double running stitch. In the later forms of the blackwork in England, you will find stem stitch, seed stitch. There are various types of stitches, and depending on the type of embroidery stitch you're doing, some of them can be, and this is where you have to get very meticulous on how you do your embroidery, but some of them can be reversible and then others not. And so to me, that's very fascinating that, and also it depends on what you were embroidering. If I was doing embroidery for sleeves, for example, it doesn't really matter if my sleeve is reversible or not, unless I need it for the cuffs, because there is a particular smock, I think it's from circa about 1575, 1585, where you can see the embroidery goes all the way down, but then the cuffs flip back, and so it is reversible on the cuffs. I don't know about the rest of the sleeve. The museum doesn't provide the underneath side of the sleeve, but you can see the side of the cuffs where the museum even says that the cuffs are reversible. With the blackwork embroidery that exists in Hans Holbein the Younger's portraits, some of them you can zoom in and be able to see the intricate details and recreate the patterns from the portrait. I've already done this, and I will have videos on my YouTube channel that have that in there, as well as having pictures with the patterns on my embroidery blog. The German and Italian books that I mentioned earlier also have patterns, and the neat thing is, in those pattern books, not only do they have patterns for the geometric patterns, but they also have patterns for the curvy linear patterns that were iconic in the later 16th century in England. And so depending on which type of pattern you would like to embroider, you can either do the counted stitch on the linen, or you could trace a curvy floral pattern onto your fabric and then be able to embroider over that pattern. One interesting tidbit to know, earlier when I mentioned the blue ink that exists on some of the examples at the Victoria and Albert Museum, and the reason why we see the blue ink is because the English used a lot more iron in their thread for making it black. And the thing is, that's helped to erode the threads over time. So you can still see holes in the fabric where the embroidery was. You can now see because the thread has eroded. And so you can see some of the threads for some of the embroidery, but then on other parts of that same piece, we just see the blue ink where they had originally had the embroidery. Whereas Spanish, if you use Spanish thread, they didn't use as much coal to or iron to make the thread black, and so it hasn't eroded. And so if they were using Spanish silk thread, well, that thread is still intact today on a lot of embroidered pieces at museums. And even with just referring to it as blackwork, the reason why I'm putting in quotations is because specifically in England, as you look at different forms of embroidery that fall under this category in 16th century England, you'll find that saying blackwork is a very broad spectrum. It's like everything's under the umbrella. And what I mean by that, where I mentioned earlier with the Holbein stitch, the double running stitch, and then later with the curvy linear, it was still done in black thread. So pretty much any embroidery done in black thread is considered blackwork. However, if you look at, for example, Bess of Hardwick, in her portrait, she has red sleeves. It's still the double running stitch. It's just done with red thread rather than black thread. But then later on, the same type of swirly floral patterns that are iconic of the later form of blackwork were done in color. And so you can find, for example, you might find a jacket at a museum that is done in the same type of stem stitch and seed stitch and the various forms of stitches that they would create the curvy linear or swirly floral patterns, but they might have reds or blues or greens in it and not just black. As it was, this type of embroidery was popular in England till about 1630, when it finally just started to fade away and no longer became fashionable, other than finding this type of embroidery in various samplers. So if you look at a museum website and see a sampler, you might still find the geometric patterns or even the swirly floral type, but probably the geometric patterns I have found on various samplers in the 17th and even into the 18th century. As you've probably gathered by now in my video, that I am passionate about the earlier form of the 16th century English blackwork embroidery. But with that, as I mentioned earlier, that there were German and Italian books. If you're interested in learning more about embroidery, there is also a 17th century embroidery book, and I believe that one's at the Met Museum. I will have a link below in the description. But what's neat about the 17th century, it's Portuguese. It's an embroidery book, but it actually, instead of the German and Italian books that just simply had pictures that were printed on a page, the Portuguese book actually has embroidered samples. So it looks like someone embroidered the linen and then stitched it all together and then made that a book. So then that means even if the thread is missing, you can still see the holes where the pattern may have been, and then you can recreate it. But it's just, to me, I think that's super neat. For the SCA, I know our cutoff is 16th century, so like 1600 is the cutoff. So to use a 17th century Portuguese embroidery book is technically outside of our realm, but that's a place to start. So if you're interested in doing Portuguese, or with that doing Spanish embroidery, that's a place to start, and then work your way backwards to find yourself in the 16th century area. That would technically work and that's even if you're working on an arts and sciences project that you're submitting to be judged within the SCA, because otherwise, if you're doing something, if it's from 1605, 1610, 1615, if it existed in 1610, there's a really good chance it probably existed prior to 1600, and we just don't have documentation for it. But that's my humble opinion, and I'll get off my soapbox. So what is blackwork? Blackwork is a reversible embroidery stitch, usually done with silk thread on linen. Over the centuries, as I mentioned before, blackwork has also been referred to as Holbein stitch, back stitch, Spanish work, festoon stitch, square stitch, or double running stitch. Or it's also known as Mamluk embroidery. By counting the threads, the double running stitch is a series of 2 journeys. On the first journey, the pattern is to work every other stitch. And with that, you will get an in, out, in, out, in, out pattern. Then on the return journey, you fill in all of the blank spots to create one continuous line. So on the return journey, you will go in, out, in, out, in, out, and the finished product looks like a single line. What materials do you need? A slate frame is historically accurate. However, if you want to use just a round frame, not historically accurate, but it's still, you can still work with it. Or you can also use a scroll frame. I personally advise not to do the scroll frame, but that's just personal preference. I've tried a scroll frame before and had difficulty keeping my tension. If you use a circular hoop frame, the problem with that is, again, with your tension. As you move the hoop frame across your fabric, you tend to warp the linen a bit, and then it makes your stitches uneven. Next, after the frame, you need linen fabric. Blackwork could have been done on other fabrics, such as velvet, but it was primarily done on linen. Also, you need silk thread. There were other types of threads used, such as cotton, but very rarely. And I've actually tried using cotton thread before and found it to be quite difficult. The silk thread, if you have a knot in your thread one way, you just pull the knot in the opposite direction and the knot comes right out. It's very easy to work with and it's very pretty. Depending on if you get twisted or untwisted silk thread, you can have an extra shine to it. The cotton thread, I found just if it got twisted up, it got knotted, it was difficult to get the knot out, and it's not as pretty, in my personal opinion. So you've got your slate frame, your fabric, your thread. You also need a needle. Beeswax is optional, but I highly recommend it, at least for the ends of your threads, to help your thread not fray. And you need to decide on a pattern. What is a slate frame? A slate frame is just simply a box frame where you stitch your fabric in the middle of the frame. And it helps keep the tension on all four sides. If you look on the page here, on the left-hand side, you will see an example of silk embroidery being done in 1568, and that's a German picture there. In the middle is what a slate frame looks like today. And on the right-hand side is a painting by Francesco Casa from about the late 1400s. And again, you can see the slate frame, but also if you look, it looks like there's legs on the slate frame, so it could be used almost like a table. What type of needle do you use? If you look on the left-hand side, there's an enhanced portrait of Costanza. I'll probably mispronounce this, and please correct me if I do mispronounce this, Costanza Cantani. And that's also from the late 1400s. And in that portrait, you see her with pins, a thimble, and sewing needle. For my black work, I usually just typically use the same type of needle like what you would use in today's modern cross stitch. But that's what I use. On the right-hand side of the screen, you will see Viking era needles, and that's from Coppergate. The one thing you have to make sure of is if the eye of your needle is larger than the pointy end of your needle, then that might warp the linen a bit. So you want a needle that is about as straight as possible where the eye is not any bigger than the rest of the needle. That way it doesn't warp the thread at all and warp your fabric at all and create holes in your fabric. You also want to use a very thin needle for the same reason. What type of silk thread? I recommend using, and I'll probably mispronounce this, soy perle. This is a twisted silk thread that only needs beeswax applied to the ends of the threads. There is also the soy ovale. If I've mispronounced that, please let me know. And the soy ovale is an untwisted silk thread. This thread is shinier than the soy perle, but it also frays a lot more. I can show you examples of that later in this class. So the soy ovale is shinier and prettier looking, but with that one you really want to use the beeswax on it because it will fray, and the backside, it will look like a mess after a while. For Egyptian threads, blue, red, and brown, the brown could be faded black for common embroidery threads used in pre-15th century Egypt embroidery. The brown threads that we see in examples in museums may have originally been black, since the iron used to dye the threads can fade over time as well as erode the thread. Black silk thread on white linen was definitely the most popular and the most favored in Europe. Red thread was occasionally used, as we saw previously in Bess of Hardwicke's sleeves. In England, gold and silver threads were also used. However, a person had to be careful when using gold or silver threads due to the sumptuary laws. Among the restrictions listed in Elizabeth I 1574 statute was that for gold, silver, or pearl embroidery, it was reserved for only dukes, marquises, earls, including the children of all three, viscounts, barons, and knights of the garter. Here's an example of a woman's Italian shirt from the late 16th century. This example is in the Textile Museum in Prato. And one of the things that I find neat about this shirt is not only is there black work on the cuffs and around the collar, but it's also going up the sleeves. If you look where the sleeves join the shirt, there on that seam, there's blackwork embroidery on all of the seams. So where there are gores on the sides, down the front and on the sides, going towards the bottom hem, there's more blackwork on all of the seams. I think it helps give it character. I love it. Can Gutermann silk thread be used? Gutermann silk thread can be purchased at Joann Fabrics or any local fabric store. It's machine washable, and it's a nice thread to begin learning blackwork on, especially if you can buy it cheaply with a coupon. I know Joann Fabrics a lot of times has like a 40% off coupon, which makes the Gutermann silk thread ideal and as a learning tool. Plus, it's machine washable. If, for example, if you look on the bottom right in that picture, those are cuffs I made for my son's shirt when he was, I believe, 4 years old. He was still able to fit in that shirt when he turned 6, and he did youth combat in the SCA wearing that shirt. Now you can just imagine how much sweat and dirt went into that linen shirt that he wore. And because I used Gutermann silk thread on that shirt, I was able to machine wash it and keep it white, amazingly. However, as far as using Gutermann silk thread or not using Gutermann silk thread, if you're aiming for historical accuracy or you want a more bold thread, then I would not recommend using this. The Gutermann silk thread tends to be very thin, and so you can see it up close, to see the pattern, but as you step away, you cannot see the person's pattern as easily because it is very thin. And also, like I said, for historical accuracy, you would want a bold thread. That way, when you're standing more than 6 feet away from someone, they can still see the embroidery and actually see the pattern, and then they can compliment you on, wow, look at that pattern. What items were embroidered? The Moorish embroidery had been used to decorate various household items such as towels, napkins, and cushion covers, as well as garments such as robes and veils. In Europe, clothes were embroidered, such as shirt sleeves, ruffs, cuffs, coifs, doublets, nightcaps, falling bands, along with handkerchiefs. Part of this was to do embroidery. It takes a lot of time, especially if you are doing blackwork embroidery on sleeves, on the fourth part of a skirt. That takes a lot of time. And so they like to wear their wealth. And if you can afford to just simply sit there and do embroidery all day, then that means you have lots of luxury. You have extra time on your hands. And so aside from your pearls, your velvets, your furs, depending on your station, you would also show off the blackwork embroidery. What about a pattern? On the left-hand side is a 16th century Italian sampler from the Victoria and Albert Museum. And with this sampler, I will put the link in the description below, but there is a website out there and they have, I believe it is 25 to 30 patterns that have been recreated from this sampler. And then on the right-hand side is Jane Bostock's English sampler from 1598, and that is also at the Victoria and Albert Museum. One of the nice things with using a sampler is you can sit and pick out which pattern you want to use for your particular item. So if you want to embroider cuffs, I can look at this and I could recreate that specific pattern, or I can use it as inspiration while creating my own pattern. Now, if you're just starting out, I suggest to start with a simple pattern. On the top left-hand side is a pattern from Egypt. It's about circa 13th to 14th century. It is blue silk on linen. I believe it's unbleached linen. And if you look, it's just got a simple line on top. And then right below that is another simple line. And then a little zigzaggy pattern going from the top left, zigzag on the diagonal to the bottom right. And then two more straight lines underneath that. Fairly simple as far as blackwork patterns go. On the right-hand side is Nicholas Basset's new model book pattern, which is German. It's from 1568. And with this pattern, it just looks like crosses, one right after the other. Again, fairly simple. With this pattern, unlike the one on the left, the Nicholas Basset's pattern, you can use probably using just one thread. So you would just go on your first journey, left to right, and then on your return journey, going right to left, and your pattern's done. On the bottom is the portrait of a lady as Saint Lucy by Giovanni Antonio Boltraffio. It's from about 1509, and that's at the, sorry if I mispronounced this, Thyssen Bornemisma Museo Nacional in Madrid, Spain. And as far as blackwork embroidery, I think this is the most simple pattern. If you look right on the edge of her collar, beneath the necklace, you'll see the necklace, a little bit of skin, and then the square neckline of her dress. And right on the edge of that square neckline is a single dashed line. About as simple as you can get for blackwork. So how do you begin? First, you want to weave your thread in and out, typically through the fabric. I shouldn't say typically, sorry. Going ahead of myself. Yes, so first you want to weave your thread in and out through the fabric. Typically, I work left to right, and I count approximately every third or fifth hole per stitch in the linen fabric. Later, I can show you the differences between every third hole and every fifth hole, because that will then determine how small or how big your pattern is. And once you are at the end of the line, then the return journey begins, and that's where you fill in the spaces. And then when you are done, you want to weave the tail of the thread into the pattern on the underneath side. You also do this at the very beginning when you start off. So when you start off, you'll have a little bit of the tail on the underneath side, and you'll just weave it into the pattern as you go left to right, and then return, and then the end of your thread gets woven in at the same place your tail was. If you're in the middle of a pattern, you might be able to split it, part on the left, part on the right, but I can get into more of that later. Another option is to tie a knot at the end of your thread. However, if you do tie a knot, there are a couple of issues you may want to know about. One, depending on how big or how small you tie your knot, if it's small and you machine wash your fabric, that knot may pull through the fabric, and now you've lost part of your pattern. The other thing is, if you want your pattern to be completely reversible on both sides, depending on how many stitches your pattern was, where your knot is may not be at the exact starting place as where your thread started. So on the underneath side, you might have a knot here and a knot here, and a space in between where there should be another stitch. Again, personal preference. I have known some people to knot their threads and they like to do it. I just recommend testing out and see what works for you. On the picture here, you will see at the very top, the pattern is that simple line that I mentioned on the last screen. That was on the square neckline. It's just a single line. And so to start off, here you have the dashed look of in, out, in, out, in, out. And then when you get to the end of your, whatever it is you're embroidering, the end of your cuff, collar, whatever, then you start your return journey. And now you go back, right to left, back to where you began. And again, you do the in, out pattern. And in the end, you have a complete picture. So again, what do you do with the end of your thread? On the far left-hand side, you can see where I had just done a quick sampler. And on that sampler, I was testing out different silk threads. The very top thread is the Gutermann silk thread. And then the middle, I believe that one was the untwisted silk thread. And then the third one down was the twisted silk thread. That's the differences between the soie ovale and the soie perlée. But I was also testing out the differences between beeswax on all of the thread, just on the tail ends, or no beeswax at all. That's why there's 3 sections of 3. But for my quick sampler, you can see where I wove the tail ends into the underneath side of the pattern. If you want to try to be a little more neat, in the center section, or the center picture, it's the backside of a sampler by Elizabeth Burton, about 1701. So I know that's out of the time period for the SCA because we only go up to the 16th century. But anyways, the backside of this sampler, it's from 1701. It's in the Philadelphia Museum of Art. But as you can see, you can see where some of the tail ends are, but for the most part, to me, this looks fairly neat and pretty. On the right-hand side is a collar I had done, and that is with the soie ovale silk thread. And with that, there's no beeswax on the tail ends of the fabric or on the thread, and that's where I learned the hard way to use beeswax on the tail ends of your thread. After you've embroidered your piece, then attach it to your garment. On the left-hand side, you will see where I embroidered the cuffs and the collar for a shirt, and then I cut it off of the slate frame, and I attached it to a shirt for my husband. Do you want a challenge? Try doing reversible cross stitch. This is a 16th century shirt. It's at the V&A Museum, and I can put the link below for more information. But with this collar, the cuffs, everything, it's reversible cross stitch, which if you look at reversible cross stitch is Blackwork Embroidery, just done in little X's all over the shirt. Now, before how I mentioned a slate frame for your embroidery, here's my pieces for a slate frame. I did a video about 3 years ago on how to dress a slate frame, and looking back at it, it's on YouTube, but it's pixelized and the angle isn't very good. So keep an eye out. I plan on doing an updated video on how to dress your slate frame. And when I mentioned the differences between Gutermann silk thread versus like the soie ovale or the soie perlée, this is just to show you this is what Gutermann silk thread looks like. So it's blue, blue plastic, and then very thin silk thread. The soie ovale and the soie perlée, this is how they're sold. As I mentioned before, you can use the circular hoops. Just be cautious because it will warp your linen thread a bit. So once you're done embroidering, I suggest taking your thread off of the hoop and giving it a chance to rest and try to move the thread a bit so that way it doesn't work as much. Remember that sampler where I mentioned the differences between using beeswax and not using beeswax, and the differences between the Gutermann silk thread and the soy ovale and the soy perlé? Here is that sampler. So if you look, this is the Gutermann silk thread, and then the untwisted, and then the twisted silk thread, and then this section has no beeswax. This section just has beeswax on the end, and then this one, it has beeswax throughout. But like as I move back, you can see the twisted and the untwisted are still pretty bold, whereas the Gutermann silk thread is starting to fade away because, well, it's a thin thread. The differences between the third hole and every fifth hole, this is a sampler. Remember that 16th century Italian sampler I talked about? These are patterns from that sampler. And if you look, oh, I'm on the back side too. If you look, this is every third hole on the whole sampler. This is a coif I made for my daughter, and I believe it has 88 diamonds. Each diamond with a flower in the middle took me about 20 minutes to do. And this is every fifth hole. So to show you the size difference, this is every fifth hole on the flower, and this one on the left is every third hole. So that's the differences between the sizing. So if you're doing something small like a collar or a cuff, I recommend doing every third hole. You will find it's also easier to weave your tail in back into the fabric on the underneath side. If you do every third hole, you're doing something larger like sleeves or the forepart to a skirt. You probably want to do every fifth hole, otherwise you'll be at it all day long. As far as whether to do every third hole, every fifth hole on historical accuracy, I think that was just more or less personal preference, because a lot of the patterns that we look at that we can find are in portraits, such as Holbein's portraits. And we can find the pattern, we can recreate the pattern, but we can't tell just by looking at the painting if it's every third hole or every fifth hole. Remember how I mentioned learning the hard way about using beeswax, at least on the ends of your silk threads? On the Gutermann silk thread, you don't need the beeswax, but if you use the soy ovale or the soy perlé or any other silk thread like that, you'll want to use beeswax at least on the end. Here is a partlet that I stitched, and on the underneath side is the untwisted without any beeswax, and then sections of it you can start to see where it's fraying. Let me see if that zooms in. So you can see where it's fraying right there. So again, use the beeswax. I have explained about using linen fabric as well as using silk thread. For today, I will be using just simple Gutermann silk thread that I bought at Joann Fabrics. And I will also be using just normal cross-stitch material. That way it's easier to see the holes for this instruction. Now when doing blackwork embroidery, you will see I've gone in and out on the first journey, and then on the return journey you will take your thread and fill in all of the spaces, so that way you end up with a continuous line like here or here. So to show you, actually I will start here. If you can see, my needle is right here, and then I'm just going to do a straight line. So you want to pull it through, but not all of the way. You want to keep a little bit of a tail on the back side, and you will be weaving that tail into your embroidery. So now I've gone down the next hole, and as you can see, I still have that little tail right here. And now I'm going to go up the third hole. So as you can see, I've gone up the first hole, down the second, and now I'm going into the third hole. And on the backhand side, I am making sure that my tail is in between the two threads, so that way it's being secured. And now the needle will go down the fourth hole. And to give you a visual for the back side, I'm going to hold the tail like that. So see, the tail is here, and now I'm moving it over on the other side. And now I'm putting the needle into the next hole, and that will help secure the thread. Like so. And you want to make sure to keep your tail nice and taut. That way it will blend in with the line. And from here, just however your pattern is, like with me, I'm just doing a straight line across. So you just continue with your pattern going from left to right. Then you will start your second journey. So if this was the end of my line, now I'm going to start the second journey, and I will now be working right to left. And from here I'm just going to fill in every hole. So now I'm going back, and here I'm making sure that my thread is woven in to the thread as it goes through. So with this, if you can see, the thread is on the bottom right here, and then I put it in on the top on this side. That way the tail is sticking in between the thread, so as I pull it tight, it's woven into the pattern. And as you do this, you can start to see your single line starting to appear. And now your line is reversible right there. Now that I'm done with the line, as you can see, I have my thread here, but I need to finish off my end. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to weave it into the line. So I'm taking the needle and going through each stitch, putting the needle underneath the threads, and then pulling through on the other side. Once you are done, I like to give it at least ½ inch to an inch worth, just to make sure everything is not going to unravel later. But once you are done doing this, I'm going to do one more. Then you just want to cut the thread as close to the embroidery as possible without hurting the embroidery. There we go. To do the double running stitch, which is the embroidery that I have been focusing on for many years, it is counted stitch. And with that, you will have your linen, and you simply have your pattern, and then you create by counting the holes, and you create your pattern from the pattern that you already have created. That's a lot of creating. So we'll just say you are doing a simple line, but you are doing the Holbein stitch, the double running stitch, the geometric counted stitch of Blackwork. What you are going to do is you are going to have your pattern and then decide, do you want to do every third hole, every fourth hole, every fifth hole? Depending on how far you're going to count will then determine how small or how large your embroidery project is. But we'll just say you're doing a line. I like to start left and then go from left to right and then back. but that's personal preference. You could start from the right and then go to the left. If it's a circular pattern, I like to start in the center and then work my way around going clockwise and then filling in all my stitches counterclockwise. And what I mean by filling in my stitches, it's a double running stitch. So if I start on my far left, and then I will count over 3 holes and then put my needle down through the fabric. Count over 3 holes and then my needle goes up. Count over 3 holes and my needle goes down. And so then I've got a dashed line on my linen. Once I get to the very end of where I want to stop, my needle will then, with the silk thread, will then go back the way I came, going up and down through the fabric, and then I will be filling in all of those blank spots, so in the end I will have a straight line that is reversible on both front and back, but it's all counted stitch. And from here, this is where you can get into all of the intricate patterns. You can do lattice patterns, you can do flowers. There are all sorts of things you can do that are geometric shapes, but it's all counted stitch. Now, if you're looking to do more of the swirly florals, Blackwork Embroidery Stitch, which is more common from about 1540 on up through 1600, and you will find this a lot on sleeves, on the top part of a smock, on coifs, you will find the swirly floral stitch. And what they would do, they would use a method called pouncing or prick and pounce. And so you would have a pattern. They actually have books. For example, here is a book, and inside this book there are patterns, and there are German pattern books, there are Italian pattern books. The funny thing is they plagiarized off of each other. And so you'll find the same German pattern 20 years later in an Italian book, or vice versa, where page 18 on the left side is the same as page 21 flipped on the right page of someone else's book. So they plagiarized off of each other. But you would have these pattern books, and so from there, from the pattern, I could then poke holes in the pattern, lay that pattern down onto the fabric, and then take something like charcoal powder and just brush that on. And so then I've got little dots on my fabric, and then they would take ink and trace over, and then they have now transferred that pattern onto the fabric, and then they would embroider over the pattern. And we know that they used ink to put the pattern on there because specifically in England, I believe it was the iron, but when they would do their black or make their thread black, they used, and like I said, I believe it's iron, but they used more iron than what the Spaniards did. And so over time that thread has disintegrated. So in museums, for example, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, they have a couple of coifs that have embroidery on it. The thing is, you'll see some embroidery, but then the rest of the embroidery has disintegrated, and then we just see the inked pattern where they embroidered over the pattern to create the call. And also it makes sense to use, if you're using black silk thread, it makes sense to use black ink, because black on black, you're not going to see the ink as much once you are done with your embroidery pattern, especially depending on the type of embroidery. It might be thicker than the inked line, so it's going to be hidden. A fun thing with that, how I said with Spaniards did not use as much of the black. It was still black thread, but they did not use as much as the English did. And so if you go to a museum and you find a Spanish piece, or if all of the embroidery is intact, it probably is a Spanish piece, or at least done with thread originally obtained from Spain. And you know this simply because it hasn't disintegrated yet. Where I said I like to focus specifically on counted stitch for Blackwork embroidery, but also known as Holbein Stitch or double running stitch. This is a sampler I did years ago, and these are 16th century Italian patterns that are on a sampler at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. And as you can see, the embroidery is pretty much reversible. The only thing that can tell you what is the front and what is the back, this is the front, and the only telltale sign that this is the back is if I zoom in closely here you can see where the tail ends are for my thread. And I have found a couple of examples that I was super excited about from, and I believe it's at the Victoria and Albert Museum, where they have the backside of the embroidery and you can see where the tail ends have been woven into the patterns. And so that just made me super excited to see what I've been doing all along is historically accurate. For this sampler, I used Gutermann silk thread. If you are looking just to get started with blackwork embroidery and you want something that is cheap, that's machine washable, then this is it. It is not as bold as some other silk threads out there, but this is a good starting place. But on this sampler, I did every third hole. So you have holes within the linen, and so I would count over 1, 2, 3, and then do a stitch, and then 1, 2, 3, and then do a stitch. To show you the difference, this is every fifth hole. As you can see, this pattern is larger than this pattern over here. This is a partlet, and this is a combination of a couple different historical patterns. For example, this ocean wave pattern here, this is from the collar. It's the, I believe it's called a noble boy, portrait of a noble boy with a marmoset. It's at the Kunsthistorisches Museum. It's either in Vienna or Basel. But either way, portrait of a noble boy, and right along the collar here, it's a Hans Holbein the younger portrait, and he has the ocean wave pattern, so I've incorporated that in there. The ocean wave pattern can also be found on the cuffs of Jane Seymour, the third wife of Henry VIII. The only difference is on her ocean waves, there are little tails, right? You've got part of an ocean wave, and then there will be a tail down on the diagonal. And then on the diagonal pattern here, this pattern is from James Stuart, who was the Earl of Moray, the half-brother of Mary, Queen of Scots. He's also illegitimate, but the flower pattern on his pattern is different than my flower pattern, so I modified the flower pattern to make this one more my own, but I still stayed within the rules of blackwork embroidery. If you are looking for inspiration on an embroidery pattern that you would like to embroider, I highly recommend looking up some of Hans Holbein the Younger's portraits. And even with that, here is to me a funny little thing. The double running stitch, the geometric reversible pattern, well, embroidery that I do, is also known as Holbein Stitch. The thing that I find amusing is if you look at Hans Holbein the Younger's portraits from about roughly 1540 on, some of his portraits have this swirly floral kind of blackwork embroidery and not the geometric blackwork embroidery that was iconic from England earlier in like the 1520s and the 1530s. But even though he painted the swirly floral kind as well, it's the geometric kind, the double running stitch that's reversible, that is still considered Holbein Stitch. And I think that's probably because there were other artists during the time from Europe from about 1500 to 1550 that were also painting blackwork in their portraits, but you'll find one artist only painted one artist maybe painted 2 portraits with blackwork, whereas Holbein had at least 25, 26 different portraits or drawings that we know of today that have blackwork. So we know that some of the portraits he painted over the years have been lost to things such as fires, because he painted in the 1530s into the 1540s. I believe he died in 1543. And so 500 years later, yes, some of the portraits no longer exist, but we have his drawings, and we know from the drawings that the portraits had blackwork embroidery. And so who knows how many more may have also had blackwork embroidery where we don't have the drawings. And so it makes sense that from that time period, he was the person, the artist that was painting the most portraits with blackwork in it. And when I'm saying blackwork, that is either the counted stitch type or the swirly floral type. I hope that I have answered your question as far as what the differences are with blackwork, because blackwork is so much more than one type of stitch. You do have the double running reversible stitch, which is also Holbein Stitch, or you also have the swirly floral embroidery, which is iconic from we'll say specifically from England from about 1540 up through 1600. Holbein stitch, which is a double running stitch, also known as blackwork, is named Holbein stitch after Hans Holbein the Younger. Hans Holbein the Younger was an artist in the early 16th century. He became a court painter for King Henry VIII of England, and he was there in the 1520s for a couple of years in England, and then he left, and then he came back, and then from about the mid 1530s on until his death in 1543, he painted portraits in England. And it became this double running stitch, which beforehand had been known as Spanish work, and that was after Catherine of Aragon, who was the first wife of Henry VIII. I do believe that blackwork embroidery existed before Catherine in England, because we know from Geoffrey Chaucer in his tale of the miller's wife, I believe her name was Alice, but Chaucer talks of black embroidery of both alike within and without on a white background, and that sounds exactly like the double running stitch, which is a reversible geometric embroidery that is iconic of early blackwork. And so if Geoffrey Chaucer was discussing that or describing it in his time, then Catherine of Aragon didn't introduce it, but she made it popular. She married Henry VIII in 1509. They immediately, once Henry VII passed away, they immediately got married, and then they had a joint coronation. And so once she made blackwork embroidery popular, it became known as Spanish work. However, then fast forward to the 1530s, where Henry VIII was looking to divorce Catherine so he could marry his second wife, Anne Boleyn. Spanish work became no longer known as Spanish work, but then became known as blackwork. And then fast forwards to some more time, and this Spanish work that became blackwork also then became known as Holbein stitch, and that's because other artists during this time period in Europe, some may have painted one portrait with blackwork, some might have painted 2 or 3 portraits with blackwork. Hans Holbein the Younger painted a minimum of 30 different portraits. Some of the portraits, we don't have the actual painting still, but we do still have his drawings. So we know of at least 30 different portraits that he drew or he painted that have blackwork embroidery in them. And some of these portraits are so detailed that we can zoom in, for example, on some of his miniatures that are only 5 centimeters in diameter. You can still look at the detail work, see what the pattern is on the collar, and then be able to recreate those patterns and be able to do that exact pattern today if you wanted to do blackwork embroidery. Sadly, some of Hans Holbein the Younger's portraits have been lost to time, mostly due to fires. Well, because we're talking the early 16th century. He was a court painter for Henry VIII from about the mid-1530s until Holbein died in 1543. But we still have the drawings as well as some of his other portraits that have been painted, and I think one of the most famous, popular, however you want to describe it, portraits that he did with blackwork embroidery in it is of King Henry VIII's third wife, Jane Seymour. And if you zoom in, like look in at the portrait, you can see her cuffs, and you can just from the naked eye, without even zooming in, you can see the detail work and be able to recreate that pattern. The earliest drawing or portrait I found is this drawing of Anna. It's from around 1525 to 1526. And if you look, she has embroidery on her cuffs and her sleeves, as well as on the upper body part of her dress. And then we go to the Darmstadt Madonna portrait. This is before the Protestant Reformation, and so most of Europe was still wanting a lot of Madonna pictures. It was very much a Catholic continent, I guess, at that point. But the Protestant Reformation was coming into play, but at this time he was painting Madonnas. And if you look closely, if you look here, you will notice that the lady in the bottom right looks very similar to Anna from the previous portrait. This is the Darmstadt Madonna, was painted in 1526, and the portrait has more details as far as the embroidery. She also has embroidery around her collar as well as on the dress. So much so that here I have enhanced the picture more and color coded it. So there is the pattern that is in red is the pattern that is right around her elbow. The pattern in blue are the cuffs, and then the pattern in green, that is what is on the body of her dress. And that is one of the things that makes Holbein stand out from other artists at this time, is because his detail work is so intricate that we can see the patterns and recreate the patterns today. Going on into 1528, here is a double portrait of Sir Thomas and his son John. And the son John, you can see right at the collar on the neck, he has blackwork embroidery on the collar there, and I have recreated the pattern that I see on the collar. Here is a portrait of Nicholas Kratzer, also from 1528. When you zoom in, some museums are better about being able to zoom in and seeing the pattern than other museums. This one still comes out a little grainy, but it is at least, you can tell that there is black work there on the edge, aside from the Textile Research Center confirming that the sitter is shown wearing a narrow band of black work on the collar of his shirt. This is a portrait of a noble boy with a marmoset. It's from circa 1532 to 1535. If you did a Google search with this portrait, some websites might list this portrait as being Edward VI, who was the one legitimate son of Henry VIII. That's King Henry VIII of England with the 6 wives. However, some websites might also acknowledge this boy as being Henry Fitzroy, who was Henry VIII's illegitimate son from his mistress, Bessie Blount. Either way, the museum, this portrait is at the Kunsthistorisches Museum, I believe in Vienna. They just have the portrait listed as a noble boy with a marmoset, but if you look in closely, you can actually see the pattern around his collar, and because it's Holbein, the details are intricate, we can actually see what the pattern is, and I have recreated it here. Here is a portrait of a man in royal livery from about 1532 to 1535. If you zoom in on the collar, yes, that is black work in the sense that it is black embroidery on his collar. However, if you notice, this is not iconic of the geometric blackwork embroidery that Holbein is known for. But this is still black silk thread embroidered on the collar. Here is a drawing of Catherine, Duchess of Suffolk, and this is from about 1532 to 1543. Because it is just a drawing, we don't know the exact pattern on the collar, but you can tell by how he has drawn the collar that there is blackwork on her collar around her neck. This is a portrait of Derek Bourne from about 1533, and from the Textile Research Center, Bourne is shown wearing a shirt with a collar band decorated with an intricate knotwork design embroidered in blackwork. And by zooming in on the collar, here is my interpretation of the pattern that is on his collar. Also from about 1533 is Thomas, the second Baron, I believe that's pronounced Vaux? I want to say Vaux. Sorry if I mispronounced that. Again, this is just a drawing and not the final portrait. There are a lot of portraits of Holbein's that have been lost over the years. Some have been lost. For example, there is a very popular mural of Henry VIII with Jane Seymour, Henry VII, and Elizabeth of York. It was originally painted, I'm trying to remember the name of, I believe it was Whitehall that it was painted at, but there was a fire done in, I believe it was 1678. It was the later part of the 17th century. There was a fire and pretty much everything was destroyed, including the original mural. So we do have a copy of it where another artisan had copied the mural, so we have an idea of what the original looked like, but we don't have the original. And so that's the same case with a lot of portraits where we have drawings still of Holbein's, but we may not have the finished product. We may have copies of it or others that learned from him, so it may have been a student in his tutelage that taught him or him. But anyways, I digress. Here is a drawing of Thomas, and if we zoom in closely on the collar, you can see again with how he drew the collar, we know that there is black work there. I cannot definitely tell what the pattern is. To me, it almost looks like heart shapes that are kind of crisscrossed. So I could kind of guesstimate what the pattern looks like, but we do not know for sure what the pattern looks like because, again, this is just a rough drawing and not the official portrait. Here's a portrait of Robert Cheeseman from about 1533. And if you zoom in closely on his collar, you can see he has just a very simple detail around his collar. And here I have recreated the pattern. This is a court servant of King Henry VIII from about 1534. And this portrait, I put in the diameter just because I find this interesting that the diameter is only 11.8 centimeters, yet Holbein was able to get such intricate detail work into such a small painting. And with that, we can see that it's a very simple black work as far as black work it is. There is embroidery there. We can acknowledge there is black thread there doing embroidery, but it is simple up and down black and white stripes with black thread right on the very edge, doing the detail work on the very edge of the fabric of the collar. From about 1535 to 1536 is Margaret Roper, who is formerly Margaret More, one of the daughters of Thomas More, Sir Thomas More. And this one I'm even more impressed with because the last portrait was over 11 centimeters in diameter. This portrait is only 4.5 centimeters in diameter. So even though it is a very small portrait, Hans Holbein the Younger was able to get the detail work so much so that I was able to recreate the pattern that we see in the center part of her collar. This is a portrait of Simon George of Cornwall from roughly 1535 to 1540. The diameter of this portrait is 31 centimeters, and the museum actually provided this information that I thought was neat, where it described how the portrait was required for purposes of courtship, as in indicated by the carnation and the clasp on the beret. So I just found that to be interesting. Here is the infamous portrait of Jane Seymour. Jane Seymour was the third wife of Henry VIII, and she was the mother of Edward VI, the only legitimate son of Henry VIII. This portrait is from right around 1536 to 1537. She married Henry VIII in 1536. However, she died shortly after childbirth in 1537. And if you see the zoomed in picture, we can see the pattern that is on her cuffs of her sleeves, and I believe this is why people refer to blackwork as Holbein Stitch, is especially from this particular portrait, because from this portrait, if you look, the detail work is phenomenal and we can recreate the pattern, which I've done here on the right. This is Mrs. Jane Small, formerly Mrs. Pemberton, and this is from about 1536, and here I have recreated the pattern on both her collar as well as on her cuffs. And if you look closely on her cuffs, I have two pictures here because Holbein has been able to show that it is reversible. What is on the front is the same as what you see on the underneath side of her cuffs. The other thing I think is neat is the diameter is only 5.2 centimeters, so this is a very small portrait, but Hans Holbein the Younger, was able to get the detail work very nice, neat. It is gorgeous how we're able to zoom in and look and recreate the patterns. This is a portrait of Henry VIII from about 1537, and from the Textile Research Center, the king is shown wearing a doublet with gold-colored yellow work around the collar, and with wide strips of blackwork foliage on the double front and sleeves. However, when I say that, if you look at the doublet front and the sleeves, this is more the swirly, non-geometric type. This is a freehand stitch that is more iconic of the later 16th century, especially when you go into Queen Elizabeth's reign. You see more of this type of blackwork. So this is not the geometric counted stitch that I associate with Holbein Stitch. However, saying that, this is still blackwork embroidery. This is still blackwork embroidery on a Holbein portrait, so I guess you could still consider it Holbein Stitch, even though it's not the counted geometric stitch. This is Elizabeth Lady Audley from about 1538. This is another portrait that is very small in diameter. It's 5.5 centimeters in diameter, but again, Holbein was very intricate in the detail work. We can zoom in and see what the blackwork embroidery pattern was on the edge of her dress right along the bust. This is Thomas Howard, the 3rd Duke of Norfolk, from about 1539. And if we zoom in on the collar, you can see there is blackwork embroidery. I have recreated the pattern here on the bottom right. And from the Textile Research Center, the sitter is wearing a shirt collar with a broad band of knotwork embroidered in blackwork. Here is a portrait of a lady, and depending on what website you look at, the museum says perhaps Catherine Howard. Some websites might actually list this as being Anne of Cleves rather than Catherine Howard. The difference being Anne of Cleves was wife number 4 for Henry VIII, and Catherine Howard was wife number 5 of Henry VIII. This says it's about 1540, and both of them, Anne of Cleves was only married to Henry VIII for about 6 months, and then they divorced, and then he married Catherine Howard, so that's where where artists normally, or museums normally, or websites normally pick Catherine Howard for this. However, a neat thing to know about Holbein is with a lot of these miniature portraits that he did, he would do them on the back of playing cards, and a lot of times he liked to put Easter eggs in his portraits. Specifically, if you look at the portrait known as the Ambassadors, that one is very filled with all sorts of little things that if you look at the detail work between the skull and then the cross hiding behind the curtain in the top left corner, there are a lot of little things in there that Holbein is portraying more of a story to you rather than just simply the 2 men in the portrait. So as far as this portrait with the portrait of a lady, the reason why some believe that this might be Anne of Cleves is because Holbein painted this on the 4 of diamonds. And at the time, during the Tudor period, diamonds signified wealth. And so if she was the 4 of diamonds, the 4th wife of Henry VIII, diamonds being wealth, Henry VIII was very wealthy because at this time he had pretty much obliterated the Catholic Church within England, had closed down the monasteries, took all of the money, profited from it, and so he is a very rich man. She is the 4th wife, so the 4 of diamonds. Personally, I think there is conclusive evidence that this might be Anne of Cleves. However, the museum still has it listed as perhaps Catherine Howard. Either way, if you zoom in on the cuffs right around her hands, you'll see that there is blackwork there on the cuffs. However, unlike his other portraits, Hans Holbein did not go into great detail with the cuffs here, but that might also be iconic because Anne of Cleves was only married to Henry VIII for 6 months and then they divorced, or even with Catherine Howard, if this is Catherine Howard, again, they were only married for, I believe it was about 18 months. So either way, maybe it wasn't worth the time and effort to put all the detail work into the cuffs because either way, the lady was already out the door. Just my opinion. This is a portrait of a young woman from about 1540 to 1545, and if you zoom in on her cuffs, you can see blackwork embroidery with, it looks like gold work in between the blackwork. Here I have recreated the blackwork pattern, which looks sort of like a twisted diamond pattern. This is a portrait at the National Portrait Gallery in London, labeled as an unknown woman from about 1540 to 1541. Some websites, if you look it up, associate this portrait with being Catherine Parr, who was the sixth wife of Henry VIII, but there's nothing confirming that. But if you zoom in closely on the cuffs, you can see where this is more iconic of the later 16th century blackwork, where it has more of that swirly floral free stitch rather than the counted stitch of blackwork. Here's the interesting thing. Does this portrait look familiar? This is Portrait of a Lady from about 1535 to 1540, and this particular portrait is at the Toledo Museum of Art. Both portraits are of the same woman. Both portraits were painted by Hans Holbein, but there are very tiny differences. Mostly, I think it's the color, maybe how it was restored. Either way, you zoom in on the cuffs and you can see that the cuffs still have that swirly floral pattern, which became more iconic with blackwork in the later 16th century. This is a portrait of a young merchant from about 1541. And once again, zoom in on the collar around his neck, and you can see that there is black embroidery on his neck. This is Lady Margaret, Bacon Butts, from about 1541 to 1543. If you zoom in on her collar, you can also see that there is blackwork embroidery there. However, due to how the collar is sitting, we can't see what the full pattern is, so I've only interpreted part of the pattern that I can see. This portrait is of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, from roughly 1541 to 1543, and if we zoom in on both the collar and the cuffs, we can see that there is black embroidery there. Once again, this is not the geometric embroidery that Holbein is attributed with, but it is black embroidery on a Holbein painting, so I guess you could still consider it Holbein Stitch. Either way, there is blackwork embroidery on a Holbein painting. This is a drawing of Holbein's. This is an unidentified woman from about 1532 to 1543. We can zoom in on the collar and we can see that there is embroidery there. It is most likely blackwork embroidery that is there. There is another artist who recreated this pattern or this portrait and added more detail work so we know more of what the pattern looks like. But that artist is from, I believe, the later part of the 16th century. The main reason why, even from this drawing, I could try to recreate the pattern. In fact, I started to recreate the pattern, but to me, when I look at it, it reminds me too much of a swastika, and so it just made me cringe and I wanted to stop it. It looks like it could just be like a lattice pattern, like a spiraling lattice type pattern, but just from what's there, I chose not to recreate this pattern. And this is a portrait of an unidentified woman, and this one is also from about 1532 to 1543. Once again, it's a drawing of Holbein's and not a complete portrait. But if we zoom in on her collar, once again, we can see that there is detail work that is indicative of there being embroidery there, so most likely it is blackwork embroidery that is on her collar. So as far as recreating Holbein stitches, I have put some of these patterns on some of my previous projects. Like, remember the boy with the marmoset? Well, this is a partlet I had made years ago, and it has that same kind of ocean wave that is found on the boy's collar. And once again, the boy with the marmoset, I used that pattern and then I incorporated it into a combination of a few other patterns to create my own pattern. And so for another partlet, I combined the patterns found on the collar of James Stewart, who was the Earl of Moray, and the collar of the portrait of a boy with a marmoset, and I added my own little flair to the center of each stem, keeping with the historical blackwork design. And remember Jane Seymour's cuffs? Well, from that I took the part of the pattern, and instead of having the full pattern, I took out the little ocean wave part, and I changed up from crosses to diamonds, but And then the center part, I only had one strip rather than the reflective strip on there. So I condensed the pattern and then changed it from crosses to diamonds. But here are cuffs that I made for a boy's shirt using the pattern that I found on Jane Seymour's cuff and then creating my own pattern. Here's my works cited page. And the works cited page continued. And the works cited page continued. I first like to have the portrait on the left side. This is Hans Holbein the Younger's portrait of the noble boy with a marmoset, and you can see the Blackwork embroidery right along here on the collar. And then on the right, I like to have an Excel spreadsheet. And for the Excel spreadsheet, if I pull it out here underneath the font on the left-hand side, you will see this drop-down box to draw a border, and I like to go down to draw border. And then from here, that's where you'll see a little pencil show up, and then I can start creating what I want. So if I want to, you just have to hold down the left key on the mouse, and then you can start. For the diagonals, you have to hold down the mouse to start the diagonal, go down to the other corner, and then release. If you're doing a straight line, you can do it by holding down the mouse and then going out as far as you want, and then lift up, and then you have a solid line. But for diagonal lines, you have to do each individual diagonal line. Welcome to a brief history of embroidery frames. On this first slide, you can see in the picture below, the lady has a slate frame that she is embroidering, and this painting is from 1603. What types of frames are there? There are slate frames, tambour frames, adjustable hoop frames, and scroll frames. Also, there are stretch bars and square hoops, but I won't be discussing that today. I'm mainly going to focus on the slate frames, the scroll frames, the tambour, and the adjustable hoop frames. So, slate frames. This wooden style of frame has 4 perpendicular sides with pegs or notches to help keep the fabric secure. Of the 4 perpendicular sides, there are 2 with mortises and 2 with tenons. A mortise is the hole that another piece of wood slides through. The tenon is a piece of wood being slid through the mortise, which is the hole. So if you look at the picture on the right-hand side, the mortise is the hole, so that would be the 2 bars that are on the top and the bottom. The sides have the holes in them, and then the tenons, those are the 2 that go up and down. So they go through the 2 that are vertical, or sorry, horizontal. This type of frame can be fixed to trestles. It can have an independent foot, or it can be handheld. A slate frame helps to keep the fabric taut, which means it keeps it very tight, while it is being embroidered, which allows for even stitches and it does not warp the fabric. Here are a few examples of slate frames in history. On the left-hand side is an illumination from the 14th century, and it shows a slate frame being propped up with feet, and that is at the British Library. And on the right-hand side is a painting of the Virgin Mary with the child Jesus. Mary is using a tapestry slate frame, and the frame is fixed and set up on trestles. That painting is from 1440, and it's at the Bibliothèque in France. Here are a few more examples of slate frames. On the left is a slate frame. It has legs, and if you zoom in on the picture, you can also see it has the mortises as well as the plugs on the sides to keep it in the shape that it needs to be in. And that painting is from 1470. On the right-hand side is an etching, and that was etched in 1532 by Alessandro. If I mispronounced this, I'm sorry, please correct me. Paganino? We'll go with that. But if you look in that etching, you will see where both women, they have the fabric taut. So you have the fabric, and then it gets sewn pretty much in a little zigzag crossing all 4 bars, and that's what holds the fabric both width and lengthwise, and then the pegs get put in the 4 corners, and that holds the wooden frame where exactly it should be. And if you look closely, you will see one lady has a candle underneath. She's using the candlelight to be able to see the holes, so she knows where to embroider. And then the lady on the right, she is actually using the windows, so she's using the daylight for her light to see where the holes were in the linen to embroider. Here are some more slate frames. On the left-hand side is an example of silk embroidery being done on a slate frame in 1568, and that is from a German book called if I mispronounced this, I'm sorry, the Standardbook. On the right-hand side is a similar frame construction as we've seen in previous centuries, the same type of frame with the fabric stretched and then stitched onto the wooden frame, and then it's held up by trestles or by legs, and This is also a German engraving, and it is from 1698. Also the Standard Book, written by two different authors, two different centuries, but still the same type of embroidery frame. And more historical examples of slate frames. On the left-hand side is an engraving. It's by Jan, I will probably mispronounce this, Sweelink. It's from 1627, and it's called Stitcher with Cupid. And with this, if you look, it's a slate frame, but there are no trestles. She's just holding it, and it looks like Cupid is on the other side helping her hold it and helping her with the stitching. On the right-hand side is an example of a very large embroidery frame. Actually, there are two very large embroidery frames, and this is from 1770. If you look closely, you can see the one frame on the right-hand side is so large that there are two women sitting on either side of the frame doing the embroidery. And this is a large example of a slate frame being propped up by trestles. And more slate frames in history. On the left-hand side is a painting from 1720, and if you can see on the frame, again, she's got the fabric, and then it's stitched around on all four sides to hold the fabric in place and keep it nice and tight. On the right-hand side is a portrait of Madame de Pompadour, which was painted about 1763 to 1764. And although if you look, it looks like she might be using a slate frame or a scroll frame, which I'll get into scroll frames in a minute, it's actually been noted that she's doing tambour work on that frame, which leads me to tambour frames. Tambour was a specific type of embroidery. It usually used a circular hoop, and it appears to have emerged in European history about the 18th century, or at least that's when it gained popularity in the European world, and then also into the Americas with the Western world. So for this style of embroidery, the fabric in the frame must be so tight like a tambour drum. If you can hear the pop sound as your hook goes through the fabric, then you know your frame is tight enough. Tambour frames work well with embroidering small items such as a handkerchief. Think of tambour frames as being similar to today's modern adjustable hoop frame. And more about tambour frames. Tambour embroidery originated in India and Persia, and it's known as Ari work or Ari embroidery, named for the R, which is the hold needle tool that is used. Origins of this embroidery can be traced back to the 12th century and became popular during the 16th century in Gujarat during the Mughal rule. Today, Gujarat is still the richest place for embroidered textiles. This embroidery style was later imported to Europe during the 18th century and quickly became popular due to the sensation of it being an exotic embroidery. This style of embroidery is a chain stitch that is worked with a fine hook, known as the R. The hook looks like a crochet hook with a pointy tip. Many of these embroidery frames were made out of metal, bone, or ivory. Tambour embroidery continued to be popular in Western cultures until about 1830, when a French machine was created that could do the same type of embroidery at 140 times faster than by hand. The inventor of this machine was, and if I mispronounce this, I'm sorry, Bartholomew de Monnier. He was a French tailor, and he had obtained a French patent for his machine in 1830, a British patent in 1848, and an American patent in 1850 for his invention, and it ended up being one of the early sewing machine inventions. A little side note about this gentleman, his machine, he had a few of them in his first shop after he got the patent in 1830, and I'll I'm not quite sure on the year, I think it was 1834, there were so many tailors that were afraid of being put out of business because of his machines that they raided raided his shop one night and destroyed all of his machines. A couple years later, he found more financial backing and tried to set up shop again. And again, his machines were great, but so many people that sewed things by hand, like other tailors, were afraid for their own future that they destroyed his machines, and this gentleman ended up dying penniless. But that's just a side note that he helped bring an end to the use of tambour embroidery in Western cultures. With tambour embroidery, it used a hoop frame most of the time, as we saw with Madame Pompadour, that she used a rectangle frame, but mostly they used hoop frames. So now we're on to other hoop frames. On the left-hand side is an example of a hoop frame. Remember before where I said it was made out of metal or bone or ivory? You can see that example in the left-hand side. That needlework stand is from about 1790 to 1800, and it's currently at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And then on the right-hand side is just your typical modern adjustable hoop frame that most people today are accustomed to. So hoop frames. Even though tambour work grew out of fashion, the hoop frame itself was still useful for other embroideries. For example, today, cross-stitch embroidery may be one of the first uses thought of when you think of a hoop frame. But did you know that reversible cross-stitch existed in the 16th century? Check out the picture on the right. First time I saw this picture, it's at the V&A Museum in London. When I first saw it, I thought it was blackwork. Upon closer inspection, I was able to obtain pictures from the V&A Museum, and I was able to zoom in and found out that that's actually reversible cross-stitch. So I got to geek out about that. Anyways, today, most hoop frames are made of wood or plastic. More on hoop frames. On November 17, 1903, Helen A. Harms patented her invention for the adjustable hoop frame. Prior to her invention, circular hoops, like the tambour hoop, were typically made from metal, bone, and ivory. Those hoops were not adjustable. She came up with the idea for an adjustable hoop, and that's why today they're made out of wood or plastic to help with giving that little extra bit of, I guess, bendability. I don't know if that's a word. And finally, we have scroll frames. On the left-hand side is a picture of a typical scroll frame. A scroll frame, it's similar to a slate frame. The main difference is that scroll frames have two roller bars with wing nuts on the sides. So you have on the sides just two straight pieces of wood with the mortises in them. Those are the holes. And then the roller bars on this example are the ones that are horizontal, and those have the tenons that go through, and then they have the nuts on the end. And then because of that, the roller bar, you can roll up a lot of fabric onto it. So this allows for a large piece of fabric to be embroidered at one time while still maintaining a stable fabric without warping the fabric. A hoop frame would warp the fabric because you're actually pushing the underneath frame into the fabric, and then that can warp some of the threads and then leave the imprint of the hoop frame on the fabric. It appears that scroll frames were born out of the slate frames during the 18th century. In the encyclopedia written by Diderot and, I'm sorry if I mispronounced this, de Alembert, from about 1751 to 1772, And in the encyclopedia, it describes an embroidery frame as being, quote, composed of 2 roller bars, AA, and 2 stretcher bars, BB. The slate frame is better for tautness for the embroidery, but the scroll frame allows for a larger piece to be embroidered. So depending on if you have just a single size, say 15 by 15 inches to be embroidered, use the slate frame. If you have something, say 15 by 48, then you'll probably want to use the scroll frame and then just roll your fabric onto the frame. It is known as a tapestry frame, but when you look at it online, you might also see it referred to as a roller frame, or I'll probably mispronounce this, métier à broder ancien. Please, if I butchered that name, please let me know and correct me on how to pronounce that. Now, with this particular type of frame, if you look, it looks similar to a slate frame, sort of a scroll frame, but I would say it looks more like a slate frame. The difference is, instead of having pegs in the top and bottom corners to hold the frame together, instead it's got wooden roller discs on the tops and bottoms to help provide extra tension. With this, the earliest I could find examples of this was from about the 18th century, about mid-1700s. I can't find exactly when this type of embroidery frame came into existence, but it definitely became popular in the late 18th and definitely into the 19th centuries. If you look on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see a painting. It's called The Embroidery Lesson, and this was painted in 1876. And if you look, it has the roller discs that is iconic of this particular type of embroidery frame. And here are some more examples of this type of frame in paintings. On the left-hand side is a painting called Lydia at a Tapestry Frame. It was painted about 1881. And again, if you look, it has the roller discs up at the top. On the right-hand side of the screen, this is the funny part. The title is in German, but the painter was French. The painting is Interieur mit junger Frau am Strickrahmen und spielendem Katzen. So pretty much it's a young lady doing embroidery and playing with a kitten. And if you look at the embroidery frame, again, it's got the same wooden discs at both the top and the bottom that is iconic of this particular type of embroidery frame. While I was doing research, finding out about that frame, I also found other frames that I found interesting and wanted to share with you as well. If you look on the left-hand side, I found this portrait online. It was listed as being painted by William Geats, but I couldn't find much more information on it as far as when it was painted or where the painting is at currently. But if you look closely, to me, it looks like a scroll frame. If you look on the sides, you can see the little wooden toggles that would have been rolled on the sides for the tension bars. On the right-hand side of the screen is a painting by Jean-Baptiste, if I mispronounced this, please correct me, Huysman. And he was a Belgian painter, and he was known for his Orientalist scenes. And if you look, it looks like she has just your typical slate frame. And more frames. On the left-hand side is a painting by William Geats. It's called Maternal Happiness. It was painted in 1898. And then on the right-hand side of the screen is, I forgot to write down the date, I believe it was around 1915. It was the early 20th century when this painting was done, and it's called Woman Embroidering by James Braid Sword, and I believe he was an American. And if you look, she has a slate frame in her hand. And more frames in history. On the left-hand side of the screen is a portrait that is Russian from 1780, and if you look, it looks like she has just a slate frame. On the right-hand side of the screen is a painting done by Jules David. And if you look closely, to me, it looks like she might see. You, I want to say that looks like a scroll frame because it looks like the embroidery has been rolled over the top bar, but I could be wrong. It might be a slate frame, but to me, it looks like it's a scroll frame. And the painting, if you look in the bottom left corner, it's signed Jules David. I tried to do more research on this painting to find out exactly when it was painted or where it's currently at, and I could not find the information. So if you happen to find that out, please let me know. And more frames in history. On the left-hand side is a painting by Nicholas Lefranzin from 1780. And in this painting, it is clearly evident it is a scroll frame because if you look, you can see the two roller bars on the top and the bottom, and the fabric has been rolled over it. On the right-hand side of the screen is a portrait done by Franz Kramer from 1834, and it's a portrait of a girl with an embroidery frame. However, the thing I find interesting about this particular frame, if you look closely, the frame, instead of being a typical frame, it almost looks like a belt you would wear around your waist. It has a little hole in the loop and everything like a modern belt would, and that's what's holding the fabric onto the frame. And more frames in history. On the left-hand side of the screen is a painting of a Chinese embroiderer at an embroidery frame, and this painting is at the University of Oxford. On the right-hand side of the screen is a painting from about 1750, and it's Madame de Pompadour, and she's embroidering. And from the way it looks like this is probably a slate frame, and it's set up just like a table would be. So you have 4 legs, and then the embroidery in the middle, which would be where like the tabletop would hypothetically be. And more frames. On the left-hand side of the screen it was actually a larger picture, but to zoom in on the embroidery frame, I just cut off most of the picture, and so you just see the embroidery frame. The picture itself is called Lady Jane Matthew and Her Daughters. It's from about 1790. And if you look closely, I want to say this looks like a slate frame. Like I said, I had to zoom in on the picture, but either way, if it's a slate frame or a scroll frame, I still thought this was neat because, again, it's set up like a table. So you have just 2 legs, the feet at the bottom, 2 legs, and then where the tabletop would be is where the embroidery is. On the right-hand side of the screen, I couldn't find much information on this painting. That's why I put the link that I found it at. So I don't know who painted it or when it was painted. If you know any more information on this, please let me know. Put it in the comments below. But the thing that I found most interesting about this painting is if you look, you can see the metal screws on the side of it being a scroll frame, and where she could then add the fabric around the roller bar and then tighten up the screws on the sides. And more frames. On the left-hand side of the screen is a painting by Francois Hubert. If I mispronounced this, I'm sorry. Drouat. It was painted about 1767, and it's of the Marquis de Comont-la-Force. And here, to me, it looks like she is also painting with embroidering with a scroll frame. It has the roller bars on the top and the bottom. On the right-hand side of the screen is a painting from 1770, and it's just labeled Portrait of a Lady. And it does not, to me, it does not look like it has the toggles on the side, so it might be just a slate frame. Either way, it's set up with the feet and the legs, and instead of a tabletop, you have the embroidery frame, which seems to be very iconic from this time period. One thing I did notice with looking at the different styles of embroidery frames is in the 18th century, the frames the legs were on the sides and it was set up like a tabletop, whereas in the 19th century there seemed to be just one leg, and then you would put your knees on either side of that one leg, and then the frame was in the middle. On the left-hand side is a painting from roughly about 1766 to 1784. It's labeled as The Fair Lady Working Tambour. Tambour is a type of embroidery. If you want more information on that, check out my previous video on embroidery frames. This painting is at the British Museum. On the right-hand side of the screen is a window, and it is from about 1350 to 1360, and it's German. It says Frau mit Strickrahmen auf Glasmalerei, and it's at the Austrian Museum in Vienna. And if you look closely, it's just a simple slate frame that she's embroidering. And more frames. On the left-hand side is a very simple slate frame. It's very obvious it's a slate frame. And it's from about 1730. And this was done by Martin Engelbrecht. On the right-hand side of the screen is another slate frame, and this one is an engraving labeled Embroidery Lessons, and it was engraved in 1689. And here are some actual examples of embroidery frames rather than just simply looking at paintings. On the left-hand side is a mid-18th century embroidery scroll frame from France. It's housed in the Palace of Versailles. And if you look, you remember what I just mentioned about the legs being on either side. So your feet would be in the middle with the legs of the embroidery frame on either side of you. On the right-hand side it's also an 18th century, but it's a later 18th century embroidery slate frame from North America. It's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art, and this one has the more iconic style that you see more in the 19th century with just a single leg holding up the embroidery frame. One of the differences between these two frames, if you look on the left-hand side, it's a scroll frame. You can see the toggles on the sides, where the screws are to loosen up the roller bar, roll your fabric on, and then roll it tight. On the right-hand side of the screen is just simply a slate frame with the mortises and the tenons. And just in case you're curious, I wanted to throw this in. This is from the L'Encyclopédie from about 1770, and it just shows you exactly how the tambour embroidery frame was put together. An example of a slate frame today is on the left-hand side, and as you can see, you've got the mortises, you've got the tenons, and then there are the four little pegs. On this picture, you can only see the two on the top. Those are the little metal pieces, the little metal pegs that go into the holes that hold the bar exactly where you want it to keep the fabric nice and tight on all four sides. And then after that, you can stitch anything like bias tape onto the edge of the fabric, and then sew the bias tape and sew that onto the wood. On the right-hand side is an example of just your traditional adjustable hoop frame. And like I said, with a hoop frame, you actually have two hoops, one on the bottom and one that's a little bit larger on top. And then the one that's on top, you adjust to how tight you can get it. So that way your fabric sits in there, it's nice and tight inside that hoop. The only problem is by putting your fabric into that hoop, the fabric will then get the impression of that hoop. So when you take the hoop off, especially if it's like linen fabric that you're using, it will still show that circular spot where the hoop had been. No particular order, the items that you will need for today, you will need pins, your fabric. I will be using linen fabric, scissors, thread. I'm also going to be using a thin yarn, but that's up to you if you want to use the thin yarn or only use the thread, a needle, bias tape, and obviously your slate frame. My slate frame is 15 inches by 15 inches, and as you can see, I'm using a scrap piece of fabric. So first I'm going to trim everything down to make sure that this fabric will fit onto my frame. Once you have your fabric square cut out, next you want to take your bias tape and you're going to cut 2 strips the same length as the fabric. Next, you'll want to unfold the bias tape, and then you're going to line one on the right edge and then the other one on the left edge. So as you can see, I'm unfolding the bias tape, and I've got one corner up here and I'm pinning it down. Okay, one side done. Now time to pin the other side. Now that I've got both sides pinned, now it's time to take your needle and your thread, and you're going to sew up both sides. Right now I'm threading my needle. Now that I've got the thread doubled, I'm going to put knots in at the end of my threads. And with this, the stitches don't have to be neat, they just have to be secure. And to help secure the thread on the other side, I like to take my needle and stick it in between the 2 threads. And then pull it tight. From here, I'm just going to do a simple stitch just to secure the bias tape onto the fabric. Just like that. There is a fold. There's actually 2 folds, but there's a fold right here from where the bias tape had been folded, and I'm actually unraveling that fold, and then that's where my stitches are going. So I have a straight line to follow. And once you have one side stitched up, go ahead and knot your thread and then get started on the other side. For the pieces of your slate frame, the 2 with the holes on the ends, these are called mortises, which would make these 2 the tenons. The tenon is the piece of wood that will go through the mortise, through the hole. And you want the 2 that have the tape already on there. And from here, I'm going to stitch these onto each other. So if you see, I'm matching up the edge of the fabric with the edge of the tape here. Now once you are done pinning right along here, now it's time to sew it into place. And from here, I am just sewing the fabric onto the tape. Once you're done sewing the one side, go ahead, knot off the end of the thread, and then get started on the other side. And now that this side is sewn on, time to pin it to the other side. Now, time to sew this side. Next, you want to slip the tenon through each. There's one, and here's the second one. Now you'll want to take your 4 pegs and put them in the holes to stretch the fabric. Once your pegs are secure in the holes and your fabric is stretched, I'm going to flip this frame over. And remember that thin yarn from before. You can also use string if you like. And I'm going to cut off a long piece here and thread my needle. And you want to tie it around one corner. What you're going to do is wrap the thread around the right leg and stick it through the bias tape. And then just keep doing that, and it will start to look like spiral lacing going up the leg. And if I can get my knot out, pulling it tight. And now as you go, you'll notice some of the string will start to relax. You'll want to pull it tight as you go up. And now as I come up to the end on the other corner, I'm going to do one more around the leg through the bias tape. And now, if you can see, I've got some loose string through here, so I'm going to go to the very bottom, make sure it's pulled tight, and tighten up each strand as I work my way up the leg. Now that I've done that, now I'm going to knot off this end, so I'm going to wrap it around the leg, there, around the corner, and I'm going to knot it again through the loop, through the middle, put my thumbnail over the knot, and then pull tight. And one more time, just for good measure. And now that my thread is knotted, your corner knotted off. Now you want to wrap the yarn around the leg, through the bias tape, and just do the same spiral lacing that you did before. And through the bias tape. As you can see, I'm at the other corner, but I've got some loose threads here, so you want to go back to the very beginning, pull tight, hold it in place, pull the next string, hold it tight, next string, and just work your way up. This will help make sure that your fabric, as you can see, it's getting tight like a drum. And once everything is nice and tight, then you just want to knot off this corner. And congratulations, you have dressed a slate frame. So, throughout the course of history, what have needles been used for? They've been used for sewing, such as garments, as well as fishing nets, also for embroidery, knitting, but there are also other types of needles, such as needles needed for acupuncture, medicinal purposes, or tattoos. What materials have been used throughout history to make these needles? These materials include bone, silver, steel, ivory, copper, bronze, iron, brass, cactus needles, glass, although with the glass, that was probably a hairpin, not actually used as a needle, that what we would think of as a needle. And there are probably more materials out there, such as maybe going out to a particular thorn bush and using something like that. So going from early, the Paleolithic period, the oldest needle in current existence dates back about 60,000 years ago. And it was from an animal, probably a bird, and so it's a bone, and it was found in South Africa. From between 30,000 to 45,000 years ago, other needles have been made of bone or ivory, and they were found in Slovenia, China, and Russia. Around 30,000 years ago, the earliest known embroidery example was found in Russia. About 25,000 years ago is when the first needle with an eyelet is dated to. Before having the eyelet, or I'll also refer to it as just being an eye, but before that they would have just a simple little nick in the side of the needle, but I'll get more into that later. The Paleolithic needles were made of animal bones, antlers, and tusks, and these needles, as I just mentioned a moment ago, had grooves instead of eyes to hold the sinew or the fiber. Onto the Neolithic age. About 7,000 BC, a major development in human technology happened. Armenian copper needles mark the development of metal harnessing. So before this, they were probably using just either bone, or remember how I mentioned like the thorn from a thorn bush? Something like that. But after this is when metal starts to be used. And on the right-hand side of the screen, you'll see a picture. These are of bone needles from somewhere between 4,000 to 10,000 years ago, and this is currently in the Shanghai Museum in China. And more about the Neolithic age. About this picture is of 12,000-year-old bone needles, and these were found in southwestern France, and these are currently in the Museum of Toulouse in France. I haven't found any information from specifically the Copper Age, so if you have any information, please feel free to share, and I will continue to research and see if I find anything more about this particular age. So, on to the Bronze Age. Around 1195 BC, the secret of hardening iron reached Europe from India, thus bronze needles were born. And so on the right-hand side of the screen, you will see a bronze needle with an eye. It's approximately 5 inches long, and it's from about the second millennium BC. And it's currently on display at the Met Museum, and there's a link to go view it. So onto the Iron Age. On the left-hand side of the screen, instead of an embroidery needle or a sewing needle, I included a pen-sized tattoo needle that's at least 2,000 years old. It carbon dates showing about 79 to 130 AD. The thing I find interesting about this is it's made from a skunk bush sumac handle, and it has two tiny cactus spine needles all bound together in yucca leaves found in Utah. So this is now at the Washington State University Museum of Archaeology. I thought this was interesting and wanted to share. And the Iron Age continued. On the right-hand side of the screen is a copper slash bronze needle from a copper bronze needle with an eye. It's from about the 9th century BC from Iran. It's approximately 6 3/4 of an inch long, and it's currently not on display at the Met Museum, but there's a link below to view it. So, on to the Roman Age. Remember at the beginning when I listed the different materials such as steel and bone, I also mentioned glass, but may have been a hairpin? That's this guy. It's a Roman glass needle from the 1st century AD. It's approximately 6 1/8 of an inch long with a diameter of 3/16 of an inch. It is a translucent light blue with an opaque white tail. It's a solid rod tapering at one end point, and then at the other end point it was split to 2 prongs and then drawn together and connected at the other end to create the eye. It's on display at the Met Museum, and there's the link for it. And let's fast forward on to the Middle Ages. On the right-hand side is a Viking needle case with part of a chain. Bronze needle cases were used to hold and protect needles, and this needle case actually still contains an iron needle in it. And this is available at the Swedish History Museum. On the left-hand side of the screen is an iron needle with an eye from the Viking Age. On the right-hand side of the screen are all Viking needles found from Coppergate. On the right-hand side of the screen, I included this because it's also known as a lacing or a threading needle. Technically it's called a bodkin, and it's a late medieval English silver bodkin. It has 2 eyelets and 3 circular holes on it. It's now in the Museum of London, and bodkins were used to thread cords or ribbons through pre-made holes and tubes in a cloth or a garment, or they may have also been used as hairpins. So, for example, if you had a dress with eyelets going up the dress, then you would use the bodkin to put your thread through the bodkin, and then this would help you lace up your dress. In the Renaissance, on the left-hand side is another bodkin. This is a silver bodkin from England from about 1620 to 1640. It's currently on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And dating to the 14th century, German cities had specialized guilds of needle makers. In 1496, Leonardo da Vinci constructed a machine to point sewing needles. One of the things I found interesting while doing this research was that during Henry VIII's reign, roughly about 1545, there was only one needle maker in all of London. This needle maker was an immigrant from Spain. He was a Moor, and originally the Chinese were the ones who discovered how to make needles out of steel, and then that knowledge got passed on into the Middle East, and then from the Middle East, with the Moors being in the Middle East, they passed that information on into Spain, and so then this immigrant went from Spain on up into London, and he was able to have a monopoly on steel needles. He did not take any apprentices because he did not want any competition. Well, later when he died, there was no one there in London, well, in all of England, to make needles until about 1560 when Christopher Grenning learned the trade and became the next steel needle maker. And prior to making these needles, usually a blacksmith would make them, and they were crude and rough. But eventually word got out and people figured out how to make needles. So in 1567, a small town in England called Redditch learned how to draw their own fine steel wires and quickly became world famous for their high quality and manufacturing of handmade sewing needles. And here's an example. On the right-hand side of the screen is the full portrait, and on the left-hand side of the screen is the bottom left corner of the portrait zoomed in, and it's a portrait of Costanza Catani. It's from about 1480 to 1490, and in this picture she has pins, thimble, and the sewing needle. And this painting is available at the National Gallery. On the left-hand side of the screen is a painting from about 1583. It's in the Germanisches National Museum, and it's a picture of a needle maker. On the right-hand side of the screen there's a full portrait, but I just zoomed in on the bottom part of the portrait near her hands, and it's the portrait of the wife of Philip Gundelius from about 1575 to 1585, and it's listed as being at the Kunsthistorisches Museum in Vienna. But when I went to that website, I couldn't find the painting, so I also included the website link of where I found that information. But if you look in the painting, she has a variety of things such as scissors, pins, thread, a knife, and needles. An early reference to the use of needles comes from the Bible and the Quran. In the Bible, Adam and Eve sew fig leaves together to adorn themselves with an apron for some modesty. In the Quran, the needle is one of the 5 tools brought to paradise by Adam. Many historic needles found are only partially preserved. This is mainly caused by the effect of oxidation, which destroys metallic needles after a short time. Even 19th century needles are now rarely found intact. The needle has social subtexts that spoke of social standing, technology, and gender identity. Women used to protect their needles in special cases, which were attached to their belts. Do you remember that Viking needle case from a few slides ago? Yes, they would attach it to their belt, and because these were special. And until the industrial age, needles were exotic treasures that were special and rare. The first recorded printed advertising found about a needle, it was from China in 1200 AD. And through most of history, bone needles seem to have been preferred as they didn't leave rust stains on the fabrics and the embroideries like metal needles did. And also the bone needles, they were more easily available. Anyone can go out and find, or say, go kill a bird or the chicken or whatever. You would have something for food, and then, hey, there's bones left over after you eat the meat, and create a needle out of those bones. For the needles, you would either need a blacksmith or you would need a needle maker. And then even with that, you do run into the problem with rust stains. And that's why in today's society, we have needles made of high carbon steel wire, but they're nickel plated for corrosion resistance. And here's just a little works cited if you want to check out more information. So welcome to my discussion today on silk thread colors for the 16th century. I'm primarily going to focus on blackwork embroidery. However, these silk thread colors could be used for other types of embroidery during this time period. So what colors were used? Well, with that depends on what the item was that you were embroidering. Depending on what you were embroidering, colors that were used were black, brown, red, blue, green, and possibly yellow. These are two samplers. On the left-hand side is an Italian embroidered sampler, and you can see it's pretty much just all done in a brown silk thread. On the bottom right side is an English sampler from about 1598. This is Jane Bostock's sampler, and with it you can see there are greens, there are reds. If you look closely, you can even find some blue as well as some black. So if you notice, these samplers have color in them. Here are some more examples. On the left-hand side, there are three pictures, and this is from a booklet of embroidery and drawn work. It's Portuguese from about the early 17th century, and here you can see green, you can see red, and then in the bottom picture, it looks sort of like a yellowish brown color. On the right-hand side is an Italian sampler, and this one is from about the late 16th century, and you can see it has red, it has green. If you're noticing a theme here, samplers during this time period have color, mostly. On the left-hand side is an Italian sampler. This one's also from the 16th century, and on the top you can see it has blue, then it has some green, and near the bottom it has green worked in with red. And on the right-hand side is an English panel of blackwork from somewhere between 1580 and 1620, and this one has just black silk thread. So if you've noticed the theme here, most samplers during the 16th century have color. However, if you are going to be embroidering something that is going to be worn, such as a garment with like the collar around the neck, the cuffs around the wrist, sleeves, a smock, a coif, anything that you will be wearing typically was done in black silk thread. On the left-hand side is a zoomed-in picture of the neck area of Isabella of Spain, and this painting was from about 1500 to 1504. In the middle is an English smock from about 1575 to 1585, and on the right-hand side is the collar of Lady Margaret Butts, and this painting was from about 1541 to 1543, and it's English. So, like I said, if you notice in the samplers, there were lots of color and very little black, lots of blues, greens, reds, but with clothing, it tended to be black silk thread that was the favorite item. Here are some more examples. On the top left-hand side is a painting that's called The Portrait of a Young Merchant. It's from about 1541. Underneath that is the Portrait of a Lady. It's English from about 1536 to 1540, and I've zoomed in on her cuffs. In the middle is a portrait of a young woman. This is Netherlandish, and it's from about 1535, and you can see some black work up here around the collar, as well as down on her sleeves and on the cuffs. On the right-hand side is a portrait of a boy with a marmoset, and again, I've zoomed in around the collar. One thing to note with this painting, it is labeled as Portrait of a Boy with a Marmoset. However, if you look up Edward VI, a lot of times you will find this portrait of him being associated with Edward VI. Edward VI was the one and only legitimate son of King Henry VIII of England. This painting is from about 1532 to 1535. And more examples of black silk thread on clothing in the 16th century. On the top left-hand side is a portrait of a lady. It's Italian from about 1520. Underneath that is, if you study any kind of blackwork embroidery, this painting is usually one that will pop up a lot, and it is of Jane Seymour. She was the third wife of Henry VIII. And so it's English, it's from about 1536, and I've zoomed in on the cuffs. Again, you can see it's white linen with black silk thread. In the middle it's a miniature that I've enhanced. It's of Mrs. Jane Small, and it's English from about 1536. I've enhanced the collar to show the black work around her neck. And on the right-hand side is a portrait of Lady Dacre. Sorry if I mispronounced that, please correct me in the comments below. but this painting is from about 1540, and if you look closely, she has black work around her cuffs as well as around her collar. Again, black work, black silk thread on white linen. But that wasn't always the case. This is Bess of Hardwick, and I believe she had 4 husbands during her lifetime, and each marriage helped her move up in the hierarchical food chain of England. And as you can see with Bess, if you look around her collar, her sleeves, this is all done in red. It is still Blackwork embroidery, which is also known as like double running stitch or Holbein stitch. And the reason why it can also be referred to as Holbein stitch is because many of these paintings are either done by Hans Holbein or Hans Holbein the Younger. But this portrait, it is unusual because she has black work done in red, also known as red work. And this particular painting, it is English and it's from about 1550. If you have any questions or would like to pull up any of these paintings for yourself, this is my Works Cited page, and my Works Cited page continued. To do embroidery, you have to have a background to embroider on. And from a historical perspective, from the 16th century, it was typically silk thread on linen. However, if you start to dive into linen, you might come across plants such as ramie, flax, hemp. But then when you look at museum websites, it might just say silk thread on linen and does not specify anything like the weight of the linen. Is it a heavy weight? Is it a light weight? Is it like handkerchief material? Is it very thin or is it very thick? Is it rough? And granted, there are only so many things that museums can do because they may not be able to test to figure out what plant made the linen that the embroidery is on. So that's where I have zoomed in and I've taken very up close pictures of different museum pieces to look at the linen to see if I could find something, because another one of my questions that I have is, okay, if I can figure out what type of linen was historically accurate, then my question becomes, what store possibly sells a historically accurate linen? Because with linen, there are different weights, and even just within the same weights, for example, if I'm looking at 3.7 ounces per yard, one store might have a thinner linen than another. One might be more of an even weave. There are lots of things to compare and contrast. So that is why I have created this little display board to kind of show off where I am at in my rabbit hole. And on this board so far, as you can see, let me see if I can. So from here, I have printed a couple of examples from different museums that have embroidered pieces. These are either smocks or these are coifs from the 16th century, specifically from England. And then I have different types of linen that are of different weights, all the way up to over here where this is ramie. It is very thin, it is very fine, it is very lovely, but not something I would want to embroider on, because one of the things you have to think about with embroidering is if you are embroidering on linen, and specifically with me, I do the black work that is counted stitch, you want to be able to see the holes in order to do counted stitching. So with the embroidery I do, depending on the pattern and how big or small I want it, I will count every 3rd hole or every 5th hole, maybe every 4th hole, but typically I do every 3rd or every 5th hole in the linen. And if it is so super fine like this, let me see if I can zoom in here. This is so fine, you can hardly see where the actual holes are. And then the other thing you have to worry about is the type of needle you're using. If it is a sharp, pointy needle, it might actually snag this fabric and could mess up the fabric, whereas something over here, this is a heavyweight linen, and if I use a sharp, pointy needle on this one, worst case, all I'm going to do is somehow create a hole in between 2 holes on the linen. It's not going to mess up the fabric as much here as it is here. That being said, so far, Most of the linen that I've embroidered on is from Fabric Store, and I have used both the handkerchief and the heavyweight. The difference being that the heavyweight is 7.1 ounces, and then the handkerchief is 3.7 ounces per yard. I've embroidered on both. I like both. The main thing for me is when I'm embroidering on linen, the question is, can I see the holes, and is it easy for me to see the holes so I can embroider? But I have other examples here, like I've got Burnley and Trowbridge, I've got William Booth Draper, let's see, I've got Gray Lines Linen. So again, this is just a rabbit hole that I am currently going down, and as I get more information, I will happily put it up on my website, on my blog, as well as the YouTube channel. So if you have any feedback, if you have any information on what linen you like to use, either just for making a smock, whatever, a coif, and just to wear, or if specifically if you're into embroidery, what linen you like to use to embroider on, please let me know in the comments below. Let's play a guessing game of whether the person in the 16th century Holbein portrait was wearing silk or wool thread for their blackwork embroidery. My name is Lynn, and welcome to my channel. In the 16th century, silk thread was popular for blackwork embroidery. For those above a certain station in life, during King Henry VIII's reign, he passed 4 acts of apparel in 1510, 1514, 1515, and 1533. These laws regulated what people were and were not allowed to wear to help define their status within the society hierarchy, or face the consequences of being fined for disobeying the law. These laws continued and were updated through Queen Elizabeth I's reign. As of 1533, no man under the degree of a baron's son or of a knight, unless he had lands or rent fees and annuities for his own use for the term of his life, or in the right of his wife, 200 pounds, then he shall wear any manner of embroidery with gold, silver, or silk in any part of their apparel. So if a person could not wear silk embroidery, what could they use? Cotton or linen may have been used, but wool was probably the most popular among those who didn't qualify for silk embroidery, because wool was the most popular fabric due to the successful wool trade. So, with Holbein's portraits, with blackwork embroidery in them, let's play a guessing game of if they're wearing silk or wool. Since King Henry VIII was the King of England, this game will apply only to Holbein's sketches and portraits of English subjects. I'll give a few details about the person, wait a moment to see if you can guess the answer, and then I'll post the answer on the screen. Are you ready? Let's go! First up is Anne Cressaker from 1527. We don't have the Moore family portrait as it was lost in a fire in the 18th century. However, we have the family sketch along with her individual sketch. She married John Moore the Younger in 1529. Anne was the only child of Edward Cressaker of Barnborough, Yorkshire, and his wife Jane, who was the daughter of Sir Richard Bass. When her father died in 1512 at the age of 27, Anne, his sole heiress, became a ward of the crown, a wardship which was eventually bought by Sir Thomas More in 1523. Her paternal grandfather was John Cressaker, Lord of Barnborough. What do you think? Wool or silk thread for the embroidery? It's wool. Next up is the double portrait of Sir Thomas Godsolph and his son John from 1528. Sir Thomas was a rich landowner and close friend of Thomas Cromwell. It was through this friendship that Sir Thomas's son, John, was able to start a career at King Henry VIII's court. John became a clerk of the signet and an elected member of Parliament in 1539. Thomas was a knight, but John was not. John is the one wearing the blackwork embroidery. What do you think? Was he allowed to wear silk thread, or was it wool for the embroidery? Wool. This is a sketch of Queen Anne Boleyn from between 1532 and 1536. In 1533, she married King Henry VIII and became his second wife after he divorced his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, and was the mother of Queen Elizabeth I. She is notoriously known for being the queen for 1,000 days before her husband had her beheaded on erroneous charges. What do you think? Is she wearing wool or silk thread? It had to have been silk because she was queen at the time. This is Catherine, Duchess of Suffolk, from sometime between 1532 and 1543. Her maiden name was Catherine Willoughby. She was the only child of William, 11th Baron Willoughby, and Lady Maria de Salinas, one of the ladies-in-waiting to the Queen Consort, Catherine of Aragon, who was the first wife of Henry VIII, and Catherine was born around 1519. After her father died in 1526, she became ward of Charles Brandon, Duke of Suffolk, for a few years. Originally, it was intended for her to marry Charles's son. However, in 1533, at the age of 14, she was married to Charles Brandon, aged 49. What do you think? Is she wearing wool or silk thread? It would have been silk because she was a duchess. Edward Fiennes of de Clinton, from between 1532 and 1543, Edward married King Henry VIII's mistress, Bessie Blount, formerly known as Elizabeth Blount, was the mother of Henry Fitzroy. Henry Fitzroy was the only acknowledged illegitimate son of Henry VIII, who later became Duke Richmond and Somerset, before his untimely death at the age of 17 in July of 1536. Edward was born in 1512 to Thomas Fiennes Clinton, the 8th Baron Clinton of Marstoke. He first started off as a royal ward in 1517 and later became courtier of Henry VIII. In 1550, Edward became the Lord Admiral to King Edward VI. Edward later became the first Earl of Lincoln in 1572. What do you think? Is he wearing wool or silk in this portrait? It would have been silk because in 1532 he was the son of a baron. Next up is Thomas, 2nd Baron Vaux, from 1533. He was born in 1510. In 1523, he became the 2nd Baron Vaux of Harrowden. He was also a poet. In 1533, at Anne Boleyn's coronation, he was created a Knight of the Bath. What do you think? Wool or silk on his embroidery? Silk, because he was a baron at the time of the sketch. Robert Chessman was 48 years old in 1533. He was possibly the chief falconer of King Henry VIII. He was the son of Edward Chessman, who was an attorney. From his dad, he inherited a substantial estate in Kent and Middlesex. His marriage to an alderman's daughter, Alice Dacre, brought him more properties. We don't know if he earned more than £200 from his lands, which would qualify him for wearing silk embroidery according to the Act of Apparel from 1533. What do you think? Wool or silk for his embroidery? My guess is wool. Margaret Roper, from either 1535 or 1536. Margaret was born in 1505 to Sir Thomas More. On July 2, 1521, she married William Roper, an attorney. William was the oldest son of John Roper of Well Hall. Margaret died in 1544. What do you think? Wool or silk for the embroidery? My guess is wool. Even though her father was a knight, her husband at the time was not a knight or of a higher station. Jane Seymour was the daughter of Sir John Seymour of Wolf Hall. On May 30th, 1536, she was married in a private ceremony to King Henry VIII and became his third wife. In 1537, she gave birth to Edward, Henry's only legitimate son, who later became King Edward VI upon the death of Henry VIII. Based on the time when this portrait was painted, Jane was the wife of King Henry VIII and therefore Queen of England. So what do you think, wool or silk? I'm going with silk. Mrs. Jane Small, formerly Mrs. Pemberton, was the daughter of Christopher Pemberton, a Northamptonshire gentleman. Based on the red carnation in the miniature portrait, this was probably her betrothal portrait. In 1540, she became the wife of a prosperous London cloth merchant, Nicholas Small. They were neighbors of Hans Holbein the Younger, who painted this miniature portrait. Based on her station in the society hierarchy of England, what do you think, wool or silk? I would say wool, for the simple idea that she was the wife of a merchant. Elizabeth Lady Audley from 1538. She was born Elizabeth Grey around 1510 to Thomas Grey, the second Marquess of Dorset. The miniature may have been commissioned in celebration of her marriage in 1538 to Thomas, Baron Audley of Walden, Lord Chancellor, as his second wife. Thomas became Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster and Speaker of the House of Commons in 1529. In 1533, he was appointed to Lord Chancellor. On the 29th of November 1538, he was created Baron Audley of Walden and installed as a Knight of the Garter. By being the wife of a baron, what do you think, wool or silk? I'm going to say silk. Thomas Howard, 3rd Duke of Norfolk from 1539. He was born in 1473. He was the brother-in-law to King Henry VII and son of Thomas Howard, 2nd Duke of Norfolk. Based on this alone, what do you think? Wool or silk? Silk, definitely. Lady Margaret Butts. She was the daughter of John Bacon. She served as a lady-in-waiting to Princess Mary and belonged to the circle of Queen Catherine Parr, the 6th wife of Henry VIII. Her husband was Sir William Butts, M.D., who was the personal physician to Henry VIII, who knighted him in 1544. William, her husband, was born in 1485 to John Butts, who was an auditor of Crown revenues. Since her husband was not knighted until 1544, and this portrait was made prior to that, what do you think? Wool or silk? My guess is wool. Portrait of Henry Howard, the Earl of Surrey, from about 1541 to 1543. He was a poet and the son of the 3rd Duke of Norfolk. Remember Thomas Howard from before, Lady Margaret? In 1541, he was made a Knight of the Garter. However, just by being a duke's son, what do you think? Wool or silk? Silk. I've actually taken 3 different historical patterns and kind of mishmashed them together into one pattern, and that is where I'm starting today with the first part of the pattern, which is it's just a line with some crosses on it. And this pattern came from Jane Seymour's cuffs. Jane Seymour is the 3rd wife, well, was the 3rd wife of Henry VIII. And he's the king, if you haven't heard, King Henry VIII. He's the one that had 6 wives, divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Jane Seymour's the 3rd one. And they were only married for about a year and a half. They married in 1536. She died in 1537. I believe it was in October of 1537, shortly after the birth of her son, who did survive and then became Edward VI. However, he became king when he was 9 and then later died at, I believe, the age of 15, may have been 16. But anyways, I digress. So my pattern that I have created, part of it comes from her cuffs. Part of the pattern is from, it's an ocean wave pattern, and that is from the Holbein portrait of the boy with the marmoset. And then the 3rd pattern is also Holbein, so all 3 patterns are from Holbein paintings. And when I say Holbein, I am specifically referring to Hans Holbein the Younger. Not to be confused with his dad, Hans Holbein the Elder, or his brother, Ambrosius Holbein, because all 3 were artists during the late 15th and in the early 16th century. But, so the pattern I've created is, well, it's a mishmash of 3 patterns that are all Holbein. And so you have the top part, which is the line with the crosses. That's from Jane Seymour's cuffs. Then the ocean wave pattern, that is from Boy with the Marmoset. And then the middle section is from his Darmstadt Madonna portrait. thank you for checking out my YouTube channel. If you enjoyed this video and would like to watch more of my videos, please follow the links on the side of the page. Please select thumbs up that you like the video. It helps with the algorithm. If you have questions or comments, please post them below. And please click subscribe and ring the bell to be updated when new videos come out.